Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the BA Designing with Young People webinar. This is the first time we've done this topic, so hopefully you'd enjoy it. We have a stellar list of speakers for you today, so hopefully it'll be really interesting. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the chat function. Please use the Q&A as well if you want to ask any specific questions. We should have some time at the end to pick them up. So don't be afraid, and I'll be kind of checking the chat as people speak, so I'll be trying to answer in there as well. Right, so my name is Simin Shebnaev. I'm a senior lecturer and a PhD researcher at BCU, Birmingham City University, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Tabitha Odutayo, and she's one of our beautiful student ambassadors. It's a new initiative of the BAA that we launched actually last week. She's a interior architecture and design student at Coventry University, and she also writes for a publication called Teenagers with Experience, which is for teens by teens. So she was going to be our resident young person sort of expert today, and after all the speakers come together, hopefully we'll grill them a bit. Tabitha, do you want to say hi to everyone?
Hi everyone, it's all nice to be here, and I'm excited to ask a couple of questions for you all.
So any questions you have at the end, Tabitha will be the person who's going to screen them. So who's on the panel today? We have several very different professionals. We have Nicola Wood, who's a community engager and engagement manager at Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland. She'll be talking a bit about what Grosvenor have been doing in engaging with young people, and specifically the really cool toolkit, Voice Opportunity Power. Then we're going to be joined by Mariana Schiller and Tamara Khan. They're both working on supplementary planning guidance at the moment in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, and recently had a very new to them experience of engaging with young people and sort of consulting. So they are going to give a very fresh perspective on what they think as architectural and planning professionals was the value of engaging with young people. Then we have Karen Gelenge, who's an all-round superstar, but she's the founder of Activate the City, which is okay, Karen. I'm sorry if I if I don't give it enough exactly the definition, but basically it's a community interest company that regenerates spaces with young people. Did I get that right? You can unmute and tell me if I'm wrong.
Pretty much, but I'll cover the rest.
Yes, and she's also a regeneration officer at London Borough of Hackney, so several hats there. And finally, we have Sean Peacock, who's a PhD researcher at Open Lab at Newcastle University, and he's going to talk about the future tools that we can use with young people and children. I'm rushing because all of them have 10 minutes. We're going to go in that running order, and then at the end, we're going to ask a few questions. But first of all, I think it's a good question to ask why young people, why we should be bothering about that demographic. There's 2 points that I wanted to just bring to your attention to sort of contextualize the issue. One is the sort of the statutory right that we all have, and all nations have signed under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the other one is just the pressure that young people are putting on everyone in politics at the moment. And I think we tend to ignore that demographic a lot, but I think that's no longer the case. So we need to be taking into account their views. And I think another question which we just need to be bearing in mind is, what do we mean by young people? And I just put this graphic here because there is a lot of different definitions. I think the majority of the speakers are going to talk about the sort of 15 to 25, maybe a bit lower age group, but basically teenagers and young adults. But we need to really bear in mind that actually the term young people tends to cover people from 0 to 35 years of age. So sometimes it is a much more complex topic than you imagine. The brief that every speaker got was to say why and how they think we should involve young people in architecture and planning. So without further ado, I'm going to turn my mic off and give the floor to Nicola. Let me know when you want me to change slides.
Thanks so much, Simeon. Hi, everyone. Great to see so many people interested in this topic. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to be doing my best Chris Whitty here, so apologies for the next slide, please. But first, my name is Nicola Wood. I'm Community Engagement Manager at Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland. Grosvenor is a property company with a lot of experience in making and managing places, over 300 years in fact, and our heartland is in the West End of London. But we're also active in neighbourhoods elsewhere in London, as well as Liverpool and across the southeast of the UK. So as part of my role, I help coordinate public engagement and consultation, but also develop campaigns and initiatives that help to deliver community success. So I'm particularly interested in making sure that we better represent the diverse neighbourhoods we work with, including young people, and voice opportunity power is one way that we've been doing that. We're really pleased with how it's been received so far. It launched in October last year, and I've been particularly pleased to see the feedback from young people who've already been getting involved. Next slide, please. Thanks, Simeon. So Simeon's touched on this, but why focus on young people at all? It sounds obvious, but the places that we design should work for everyone in the community. And that includes people from different backgrounds, of varying abilities, as well as different ages. But despite making up around a quarter of the population, young people are often left out of discussions around their neighbourhood. They're the people that we're building for, they're our current and our future communities, but for some reason they don't get a say. Now the stats that you can see here speak for themselves, and this is from research that Grosvenor published last year, and it tells us that almost 90% of 16 to 18-year-olds had never been asked about the future of the places they live. It's quite a sobering statistic, but it's not that they don't want to be involved. 82% wanted to have a say, so we're just not asking them. Next slide, thanks. Many of you will know who is part of the conversation, and these pictures might paint a familiar story. You might have spoken to them at a planning meeting or a consultation event that you've run, and it tends to be people that have the kind of time and capacity to come along to those events. But who isn't at that conversation is young people. Next slide, please. So we're missing out on important perspectives and experiences, but as well as that, it also isn't the democratically right thing to do. Simeon's touched on these. Young people's rights to be involved is actually protected in international law, and the government's white paper also calls for young people's voices to be heard more loudly. And then throw COVID into this mix, that's meant that exams are disrupted and people that are finishing school are going out into a really uncertain job market, which is putting a lot of pressure on their mental health. So it's more important than ever that we reach out and make sure that we're doing all that we can to ensure that the places that we create, the buildings that we design, work for young people and provide a space that they feel safe and proud of where they live. Next slide, please. So that sets out the kind of why. Why should we involve young people? Why should it be a routine part of how we design places? But you might not know how. And that's where the toolkit comes in. It's called Voice Opportunity Power, and it's for professionals like you, architects, planners, developers, maybe people that work in local councils who want to make sure that young people are part of that conversation. It's designed to provide really clear, practical guidance that can be applied to projects of varying scales and sizes. It's set out in a 5-stage process, which you can see here, with sessions that are intended to fit around a REBA design programme and an accompanying consultation programme as well. It starts at stage 1 and it runs up to planning submission in stage 3, with the 5 sessions complementing that process. It's set out in a similar style to a teacher's lesson plan, with a really easy to follow guide and lots of materials and resources you can use to run the sessions. That includes things like worksheets, surveys, a timeline, and there's even stickers that you can print off as well. It's available online and it's totally free to access and open for anyone to use, and we want you to use it as well. Next slide, please, Simeon. It launched in October and it was led by 4 core partners who you can see in the middle here. There's Grosvenor, Sport England, ZCD Architects and the Town and Country Planning Association. And it's now backed by more than 30 organisations from across the sector. So you've got local councils, developers, design teams, as well as youth organisations in the bottom left. If you're interested in joining, then do let me know. So I'm now going to run you through some key tips, which I feel really capture the essence of the toolkit that you should consider if you do want to work with young people on your project. Next slide, please, Simeon. So first up, as with any engagement process, when you're redesigning a place or a building, you need to start to get a feel of who the community are and who are your neighbours. Working with young people is no different. So what young people hang out there, who travels through that area, and where do they spend their time and meet friends? You don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of organisations who are expert in this, so partnering with them is really important. Start by contacting local youth groups and seeing if there's youth workers who think that they want to get involved and support the project too. Next slide, please, Simeon. Secondly, it's really important that you give young people a clear reason and benefit for getting involved. Why should they give up their evenings to help you out? What's in it for them? They're not just going to do you a favour. This might be as simple as work experience or a placement, or perhaps professional skills development like mentoring or CV writing. You might even choose to pay them for their time in the same way that you might pay a member to take part in a focus group. And it really helps to professionalise their involvement if you choose to do that. You could ask them to turn up on time and give more kind of meaningful inputs. If you're not comfortable with cash, then vouchers are always another option. You should always cover travel costs at a minimum. And of course, be mindful that some young people that you're working with might not have access to resources that we take for granted. So make sure there's Wi-Fi. And if you're going to be asking people to use smartphones or laptops, then consider providing them for those that might not have them. Next slide, please. As many of you will know, designs can sometimes take several years before we actually start seeing them, which is light years if you're 14 and getting ready to sit your GCSEs. So the toolkit sets out a meanwhile project, which brings around something in the short term that has really kind of quick impact that the young people can develop, design, and perhaps even build themselves. And it's hugely important to show young people how they've had an impact and that you're actually going to act on what they have to say. Again, there are organisations that do this already. There's Build Up that have done lots of stuff in Hackney, as well as Matt and Fiona, who actually drafted the Meanwhile activity for the toolkit. Next slide, please, Simeon. Thank you. So the toolkit sets out a process where young people are effectively seen as clients. They've got a really important strategic role. So with any kind of client-consultant relationship, it's crucial that you set clear parameters at the start and that you're really clear and open around what their scope of influence is going to be. So ask yourself at the beginning of the process, what are you actually asking them to input to? What can they have a say on? What is fixed? And if there are some things that aren't up for discussion or perhaps are kind of set in policy requirements, then just say it, tell them at the start and explain the reasons why. Next slide, please. Thank you. So hopefully those tips give you a feel for the toolkit and the content and its ambition. There's obviously more on the website. We're currently running the toolkit on 3 pioneer projects across the UK, and these are varying scales and at different kind of stages. So first up on the left, you can see Nottingham Trent Basin. This is a new neighbourhood in the Waterside area, which is close to the city centre, and that's being delivered by Blueprint Regeneration. The council are involved in that too. So ZCD Architects, who you might remember were a core partner of the toolkit, are running the toolkit sessions with a group of 4 young people from the neighbourhood, and they've just drafted their manifesto for the area, which they're now briefing to the design team. Second, you can see here is Aberfeldy Village in East London, which will eventually be a child-friendly neighbourhood shaped for and with young people. So Year 9 students for a local school are feeding into the design and following the toolkit process again. And last but not least, given it's something that I'm involved in firsthand, is the Mayfair Youth Forum, which Grosvenor launched at the start of this year. So for the first time in the history of the area, we're proactively inviting young people, there's 20 young people aged 14 to 18, to come and get involved and have a say about the future of this part of London. So due to lockdown, as you can see from the kind of grainy image, the initial sessions have been online, but to make sure the activity is still engaging, we've done things like post out materials, make sure they've got something to kind of touch in front of them, and also use virtual tools like Google Jamboard or Commonplace to make sure that it's engaging and fun. Next slide, please. So we're interested in finding out lots more projects where the toolkit might be used. So please do get in touch if you want to find out more, or visit the website to download the materials. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. This was the most stressful ever. I do not have career as Chris Whitty's slide turner. Right, next we're gonna hear from Tower Hamlets. Thank you, Nicola. This is really, really good. And we will send some resources at the end for everybody. So if people are frantically screenshotting or writing down links, we'll send those out. Next, we have Tower Hamlets' own place shaping team, Tamara and Mariana. And off to you. I'm so glad I don't have to change any slides on this one.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm Mariana. I'll be starting the presentation and then I'll hand over to my colleague Tamara. So as Simeon said, we're both from the place shaping planning team in Tower Hamlets Council. And as he also said, we're the ones kind of coming with a very fresh perspective, as fresh as our workshop with young people was literally 2 days ago. So it's also a really good opportunity for us to actually gather our thoughts and start thinking about how the process went and how we want to ensure the council continues doing work around that. And just as a kind of initial overview for those not as familiar with Lydon, so Tower Hamlets is there on the map. It's in East London and it's a very diverse borough in terms of ethnic backgrounds, but it's also a borough of a lot of inequality, and Tamara will kind of touch on that a bit as well. So if you go to the next one. So I'll start kind of just giving some background to what the project actually is in terms of which project we engaged with young people to consult on, which is the Central Good Growth, which is a new design guideline that we've been working on for just over a year. So I'll just give you a background to that and what the actual content of the document is, to then hand over to Tamara to actually explain how we ran our public consultation, and then more specifically within that, how we engaged with young people. So as a background, Tower Hamlets is there on the right again. So we are developing a design guideline for future housing developments in a specific part of Tower Hamlets, which is the yellow bit there in the map, which is part of the borough where there already is around 60,000 homes. And over the next 10 years, according to the Tower Hamlets local plan, an additional 7,600 homes will be delivered to meet housing need. But it's quite a sensitive part of the borough in terms of character, and there's lots of listed buildings and conservation areas and kind of Georgian terraces. So there was a concern of how that growth will be delivered. And so there's a focus in this document specifically on kind of smaller scale housing developments, so that new developments are actually sensitive to context and delivered in a more piecemeal, gradual way. And so kind of in a nutshell, the document we've been working on and that we consulted on with young people aims to promote a context-led, high-quality housing developments. And it has lots of aims. I'll just very quickly run through them. But first and foremost, obviously, to give design guidance to help deliver housing growth. As you can imagine, in London, there's a lot of demand for housing. It's also there to help to ensure that new developments respect and enhance the existing character. It's a document aiming to encourage good quality, sustainable housing. So we have a big focus on sustainability, but we also really want to promote a variety of housing types and innovation. We want to support anyone coming forward with a proposal by making it clearer what the council actually expects. And it's also a document that allowed us to describe the existing character of this part of the borough to then inform context-led design. So it's quite a long document, and it's divided into two parts. The first one, part A, it's the more kind of descriptive part. So it's where we talk about the existing character, the existing housing typologies. And then part B is the more propositional part where we actually have the design guidelines, and they're broken down into 3, but I'll show you in a bit more detail in the next slides. So in terms of the character appraisal, there's 10 neighborhoods or character places in this part of Tower Hamlets, and we, for each of them, did quite a detailed study in terms of what already exists, but also kind of key historical facts, the main typologies found, street pattern, that kind of urban design analysis. And then more specifically, we focused on, if you go to the next one, on existing housing types, since we're talking about housing in this document. So we kind of mapped out the most typical housing typologies that existed there and then compiled them according to the period in which they were built, and also the different types. So you go all the way from a Georgian terrace, which is quite common in this part of the borough, but also there's lots of post-war council estates and a lot of newer developments, so 21st century housing growth. And then, so that was the descriptive part, and then we come into the actual propositional part, and we broke the guidelines into 3. And we go basically from the kind of more high level, how to set out kind of a vision for a site in terms of a growth principle, to a more detailed design toolkit, to then design principles that cover everything from high quality materials to how to address bin and bike storage, and also promoting passive house principles. So it's quite broad in terms of all of the things we assess in terms of housing development. But then, so that's in terms of background of the document, but coming into what's more interesting for tonight. So we've been running our public consultation for almost 6 weeks now, and we've done a lot of outreach in terms of, well, specifically because obviously with COVID and everything having to be done online, we wanted to try to reach people who might not see the document online. So I can see we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll just very briefly touch on this. We sent flyers to every single household. We sent more than 400 targeted emails. We had ads in local newspapers. So we did try to kind of move to the real world as well. And if you go to the next one. And then we had loads of activities, just kind of open events, but also some more targeted workshops with self-built groups and also local architects and developers. And then obviously the session focused on young people. And Tamara can take over now.
Thanks, Mariana. So yes, well, the slide before was really to show the kind of extent that we try to go into reaching out and making sure people are aware of this consultation. We want to hear their voice. But this slide is just kind of showing we're now in the last week of consultation, so this is not kind of the final statistics, but there has been a lot of visitors on the site. We've had 3,600, but of which only 60 filled out the survey, which is actually quite typical. But the point that's really to be raised today is that of those, only 2 people under the age of 25 filled out the survey. So really bring that point forward that Nicola touched on before, in terms of not the kind of normal means of consultation don't necessarily reach young people. And the other statistic to point out is that 92% of responses came from people with some kind of white background, which is definitely not representative of Tower Hamlets. It would have been more like 50% if it kind of was the right balance. So youth workshop, why? For all the reasons already mentioned before, but I think for us specifically, it wasn't just about hearing from people under the age of 25 and also making sure that there's a space that they feel comfortable in, building their capacity, but it was also about reaching a wider demographic. And that is on one hand because of language barriers that parents might have, but at a younger age might not exist, and also to overcome the fact that architecture and planning is just not a very diverse profession. So the workshops that we were doing anyway, in terms of reaching out to architects, neighbourhood forums. These are all inherently not very diverse groups. So by reaching out to young people, we were able to kind of break that barrier down a bit. How? So this is, we did a 2-hour workshop. So this is definitely not, we're not trying to say this is best practice. This is what we were able to fit into the public consultation with the budget and time constraints that we had anyway. But it was still an incredibly informative one. And just touching up on a couple of notes here, Simeon really helped us also set this up. So we had some professional help, but it was a mix of activities. So you can see just kind of green and blue. Green where we were presenting, explaining, and then blue breaking up into different activities, sometimes breakout rooms, sometimes whole group discussions. And yeah, we also thought it was important to remunerate the participants, and we provided £20 vouchers to everyone that came. Another important how was to make sure everyone was feeling comfortable, and again, by having polls, encouraging people to not just write extensive responses, but just being able to use emojis and GIFs, and lightened the mood up a lot. So what did we actually do? There's 3 different main activities. One was a task we asked them to do in advance. So they had to pick a building, a residential building from Tower Hamlets, their favourite one, tell us why. We asked, in the workshop itself, we then discussed different housing typologies that Mariana was mentioning before, and discussed what they like about them and what not, and then also focused on the design principles. So that's the second part of the toolkit. So what did we hear? I'm going to show a couple of quotes. As it was just 2 days ago, we haven't necessarily analysed all the feedback that we've got, but I think the quality of the response we've got really speaks for itself. So this is one of the buildings that a participant brought along in terms of their favourite building in Tower Hamlets, and what they pointed out is that kind of the social value of this building to them as something that's unchanged in Tower Hamlets, a borough that's gone a lot of change in recent years. But then later on, when we were discussing building typologies, another participant mentioned how around these kinds of developments she often feels unsafe because at night time the lighting isn't necessarily as good. So really also the responses that we got were really also quite diverse and sometimes quite opposing. This type of development was quite a common one that they brought along. So most of their kind of favourite buildings were actually built in the last 20 years. But then again, we also had a comment on at the top how sometimes in these developments there are spots where I'm going to read out loud here, kids, many gangs chill and often do drugs, which is not a suitable environment for the next generation to grow up. Then I just picked out 2 of the design principles that we looked at. So scale and proportion and external spaces. And again, very insightful comments. So on the one hand, so on scale and proportion, the need for change, the need to not just be able to copy what's there, but then on the other hand, we've got here the need for also a coherent style to allow for a sense of community. And the sense of community really came up a lot, also in external spaces, the need for spaces for interaction and to have an incentive for interaction. There was quite a few students that also came to the workshop and they said they're new to the area and there needs to be something outside where they can interact with locals. Yes, and then also more detailed stuff like having more greenery on busy streets, not just in residential ones. So final slide, we had a bit of a debrief with facilitators in terms of lessons learned. And the first one, it was quite funny to see was also listed in Nicola's presentation earlier, building relationships with institutions. And the reason we put that is because every single person that had come to our workshop found out about it through either a teacher or a tutor. So although we'd published on newsletters and social media, the feedback that we got was that they're most likely to come to something like this if it's a teacher or a tutor or head of school that mentions it. Then at the workshop itself, and building confidence to speak up. If especially most of the ones that came was the first time they attended something like this, so starting off with smaller questions and then allowing them to build a confidence to then open up to bigger ones. Again, touching on what Nicola said, not everyone has the means to be on a laptop, and making sure that there's multiple channels for them to respond. So a few of the participants were not able to turn their camera or their microphone on, so they typed their answers. So it was important we had a facilitator that was able to kind of check that the chat while it was ongoing and include that conversation into the kind of main room. Then invite colleagues to help out. I think that's particularly important within local authorities where other teams might be looking at doing similar consultations, and by having them as part of the consultation, they're then able to take this idea on. I can see Simeon turning on up 2 seconds. Then finally, managing different roles. So there was obviously more experienced and less experienced participants within the workshop, and I think next time we might give them more of a role to the ones that we know in advance might be able to. And then finally, choosing our questions carefully. So now that we've got the feedback from the workshop, because we asked in the beginning kind of what is it that we can use in terms of the answers that we'll get, we'd now see directly, for example, the feedback that we've got on the buildings, that we can include that in our analysis that forms part of the character appraisal. Thank you.
I just and that was really interesting. I mean, I was part of this and I didn't actually see some of that information. We're just gonna go straight to Karen because succinct. It was in the brief that it wasn't. It was really interesting though and very informative. Thanks very much, Marianne. Thank you. And Karen, the floor is yours.
Just going to share my screen. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to start by saying thanks a lot to the Birmingham Architecture Association for inviting me to talk about what I do with Activate the City. So thanks for that, and thank you for the lovely intro, Simeon. So yeah, my name's Karen Jilenji. I can see there's like 100 of you here, which is really exciting for me. And I'll be telling you a bit about what I do with Activate the City, but essentially, yeah, I founded Activate the City in 2019. We're a youth-led social enterprise that focuses on empowering and giving young people the tools and resources to make change in their communities, particularly looking at vacant spaces. And we basically doing workshops with young people to kind of equip them with the skills and tools to like problem solve, but also make change in their communities. And the idea is really for young people to be community change agents and actually like create a legacy within their communities. And aside from that, also helping promote kind of community-led development and yeah, basically highlighting kind of the positive aspects of places that are negatively portrayed. So earlier on, we talked about like why we should involve young people in the design and planning of our cities. I think that was touched on. If this works, I would love to hear from you guys about why you think we should be involved. I think in the chat box you can say, you can actually comment. So I'd love to see some of your comments about why. I'm just going to go through 3 things that I think in terms of the work that I do and why it matters. So yeah, for my experience of like working with young people, they're natural problem solvers. And I think that's really important is that young people are really good at solving problems. So I think that's a really important aspect in terms of being able to utilize that as a positive thing, especially with developers or people who are engaged in the built environment. I think utilizing young people's ideas around solving problems is like a really great resource. Again, they're active users of public space. Young people hang out in all sorts of spaces. So they have good knowledge of like how public space is used, but except they're not really seen as an important element of it sometimes, or they're negatively portrayed when they are sometimes in these spaces. And lastly, I've put informal community experts. It's because I've said informal because young people aren't formally recognized as community experts, but they know a lot about their communities, especially like kind of the local side of it, like hyperlocal side of it, and being able to kind of talk about the characteristics of their communities, where they hang out, what spaces and places are important to them, and how that kind of relates to their day-to-day functioning and how where they travel or go to school. So yeah, basically the tool that I'm going to talk about, which is kind of focused on my experience of lockdown. Obviously, COVID-19 has been very challenging for everybody, but also in terms of like the work that I do with young people, I thought thinking about how you can navigate and different alternative routes basically of still engaging with young people. So I'm going to talk a bit about using social media during the pandemic to involve young people in design focused activities. And one way that we've done that is through running online like design challenges on Instagram. So I'll talk a bit about that, and it's one of the projects that I did and initiated in the first lockdown. So yeah, this project was called Activate Your Windows, and it was a project during the first lockdown where I invited young people aged 16 to 21 to kind of raise awareness of the global issues that were happening in the world or weren't being talked about by using their window as a blank canvas. I was quite passionate about this project because I think at the time there was a lot of things going on in the world in terms of Black Lives Matter and a lot of movements. And as you know, young people are very passionate about kind of activism and being able to kind of protest if they've been really central to protest. So I thought about creating kind of like an activity to get young people involved. And the idea was basically getting them to draw on their windows and actually like create art that like raises awareness of an issue that was important to them. As you can see, we have such amazing submissions, and it really a lot of young people from different parts of the UK got involved, and we just had such an amazing response. So in total, we had about 40 young people take part, covering 12 cities, and as you can probably agree, like these artworks are really amazing. And to make that project happen, basically we used Instagram and then also created like a pack that I posted to young people, and they signed up, and also kind of engaging them in like the competition. It was like a challenge as well, so there was prizes available for them to actually like take part and actually get to win a prize. So yeah, as I said, that was a really kind of fun project to work on, but a kind of a unique way of bringing to light what young people care about. So behind all this, in terms of the outcome, for me, it was about collecting data about young people and how COVID was affecting them. And that was really thinking long term about the work that I'm doing at Activate the City and how it can support young people's needs right now and into the future. As you can see, so one way that I did that was collecting feedback after the competition through Instagram. And you can see some of the comments about why they enjoyed doing this activity, and what it meant to them, which was really great for us to kind of like hear about. And then also using the data collected. So when the young person signed up for the competition, we asked a few questions as a way of collecting data about their experiences of COVID, and created a campaign around that, and really just capturing that and being able to actually see what response we could have in terms of helping address some of these problems that young people talked about. And a lot of that was to do with mental health, worried about the future, and also like employment. So really taking that on as an organisation and thinking about what bigger role we can play in terms of supporting young people during this time. And then the last one is about like thinking about the second lockdown. At that point, we didn't really know there was going to be a second lockdown, but again, trying to hear from young people what their worries were about that at that time. So yeah, I'm just going to share with you 3 tips for engagement, because this is primarily my experience is around social media. Before lockdown, there was plans to do more kind of like face-to-face youth programs, but really trying to adapt to the changing times. So one of these tips is, again, make it easy to participate and keeping engagement visual. I think it's really important because for young people to have something visual, because they're very like tech savvy. So their attention is drawn to so many apps and lots of like social media apps. So it's being able to say something with no words, if not just pictures. So keeping it simple. I talked about like data collection, so collecting feedback and data through surveys, Instagram story polls, and just making campaigns as well, just with using the data and making them visual. And I think one thing that's really important is to kind of tell young people what's next. I think engaging with the young people that I've engaged with during this time, they're really keen to take part in like more design challenges because it's easy for them. They can do it from home, and it's also like a nice kind of time away from the stresses of like learning from home, just doing an activity that's kind of creative. And earlier on, yeah, that was mentioned in terms of offering incentives. Again, you need to really clearly outline what you want from these young people, and they also need to be feel valued in terms of being able to participate properly. So we offered prizes and also like thinking about how they can be paid for giving feedback, because at the end of the day, like they're giving you their time. So it's really important to think about that. So I'm going to try and make this session quite interactive. I can't see you guys, but I think there's over 100 of you. I've got like a Jamboard that I've set up and I'm going to share just the link to it. I'd really love it if you could give some more tips that you have. Those are just 3 that we had, but I'd love to create like a kind of shared source that I can share around with everyone who are working with youth. So yeah, I'm just going to share it now in my chat. It should come up in a second. Might have to stop share. So yeah, I'm just going to add the link to the chat. Yeah, so there should be a link now onto the Jamboard, and I'm going to share my screen again. So yeah, I'd love it if you can just post the tips. You should be able to put a little sticky note on different tips that you have, and later on I'm going to have a look and obviously share some of these. So yeah, whilst people are adding comments to the Jamboard, hopefully, I'm going to talk a bit about the work in progress and the work that we're doing over the next year and ahead. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about like my experience. I back in 2019, I was working in Bristol for Bristol City Council, and that time it was the School Strike for Climate protests, and this is a picture taken on College Green. I was actually like inside the building when it happened, and I remember just hearing so much noise from young people, but actually looking outside the window and seeing like this view, which was like amazing to see so many young people coming out and striking and kind of protesting about climate change. So there's one project that kind of is inspired by that around civic spaces. And this is called Portable Civic, which is a project that's being developed around creating kind of portable plastics furniture to activate underused civic space. I really feel that civic spaces aren't that friendly for young people, or young people don't really engage with civic spaces as much. So it's creating basically like a furniture kit that can be assembled in any location to create these more friendly spaces. So these are just examples of civic spaces in London. You've got on the left is Haringey Civic Centre, and then on the right is Hackney Town Hall, which is also my place of work too. Yeah, just thinking about how these spaces can be kind of created by young people themselves using these shapes, and also basically looking at like underused spaces in civic spaces. As you can see in particularly in Hackney, you've got like a really lovely front town hall that is not really used that much. And I think the key aspect of this project is around how we can engage more young people in kind of planning and also the civic space and knowing what town halls function and councils function as. And then the next project is Creative Youth Labs, and that's a pilot project that we're developing in London, looking at building a platform to develop creative youth spaces on local high streets and work on youth-led community projects. And I'll start with why, because currently it's kind of thinking about COVID and the effect it's had on young people. It's been quite detrimental for a lot of young people too. And one reason is, again, in London, it's 25% of the youth population is under 25. At the moment, the rate of youth unemployment has increased by 200% since the start of the pandemic. And under 25s are now the most likely groups to lose their jobs first and be facing long-term employment. So Creative Youth Lab is like a kind of response to this, as well as looking at like the high street and kind of the decline of the high street and how that can be developed for kind of youth-led community development projects. So we're looking at developing like a web-based platform that connects young people, space owners and potential funders to deliver projects in vacant spaces, and basically creating youth innovation hubs where young people are testing, looking at problems in their communities, but also creating and testing solutions for them. And at the same time, kind of developing their employability skills. And yeah, just seeing how that could be a model for other cities around the UK or other high streets, just having like a dedicated youth space that is really focused on community development. And then these are just visualizations of my local area in Tottenham, looking at a space, how that space can really be developed and be kind of like part of the high street. And here's an example, or hopefully we'll share these slides, but there's an example here that I've provided. And yeah, and just looking at precedences around this Creative Youth Lab, there's an organisation called Ethos Lab in Vancouver, and it's basically a social enterprise that leverages the cooperative model to develop creative co-working spaces for young people aged 12 to 18. And their mission is to empower youth to transform communities and shift culture. And similar to that is the Youth Design Centre in Brooklyn. It's like a creative agency and innovation hub for young people to learn skills in STEM. What's really important and what I really love about this project is that they're focused on training young people, but also being able to get young people kind of paid work after being trained to work for agencies or kind of city councils to actually help them solve problems. And I think it's really important to kind of develop sustainable models where young people are actually, thinking about their careers as well and thinking about how they can kind of positively impact their community, but also at the same time get something out of it too. And the last one is Juxtaposition Arts. It's quite a long-standing organisation, and yeah, they develop the community by engaging and employing young people as urban artists, providing hands-on education initiatives, kind of leading to like self-sufficiency, whilst giving young people the power. And I think for me, in terms of just ending this, is what's really important for me in terms of Activate the City and kind of the future impact that we want to have is to be able to give young people like an opportunity to kind of develop themselves, but also create legacies in their own communities. So yeah, just investing in young people, and then hopefully they can invest in their own communities too. So thank you very much for listening to me. If anything that I've said resonates with you, or you're interested to hear more about what we do, let's chat. I'd really love to speak to people. I'm sure there's people in the audience who are working with young people. So really keen to collaborate with individuals working in the same sector. So just please get in touch. My email address is at the bottom, and we're also on Instagram. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. I've got my wine. We're completely beyond the time bounds I give people, so it doesn't matter. We're going to have Sean talk to us. Karen, there is only one point. The Jamboard you said was shared was view only. So if you have a bit of time now to share it so everybody can put comments in.
Yeah.
Sean, please go for it. And then if we don't have enough time for questions, everybody's on social media and we'll share a link to where you can find people. Off to you.
No worries. Hopefully you can all see my slides there. Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah. All good.
Perfect, thank you. Some really great speakers there, and obviously a very tough act to follow. So I'm not going to try and repeat anything that's already been said, but I'd love today to just introduce you to a bit of my research that I'm doing. And actually, I saw some questions around digital technology, so I might actually be addressing those questions in my slides as well. Hopefully, you'll find this interesting. So I am a PhD researcher based at Newcastle University, and I look at how we can give young people the tools, the skills and the confidence to influence change in the cities that they live in. And I particularly look at how digital technologies could actually help support them in doing this as well. I'm also a trustee of a charity based in Scotland called A Place in Childhood, so I'll give a brief shout out to them as well at the end. But I just want to briefly talk to you a little bit about my research today, some of the kind of things that I'm finding in this digital space. That's obviously very interesting to a lot of people. You know, it can almost be seen as a bit of a cure-all potentially to children's and young people's participation, but I might try and actually debunk a bit of that in some of the research that I did. So my background is as an urban planner. I trained as an urban planner at Newcastle. So naturally, like other planners and architects in the room, I've always been very interested in place and in community and in how certain groups participate in these processes. As has already been said brilliantly by others, young people don't often participate in these processes. But I've been looking at how technology and designing technology might potentially be able to help with some of that. I see a lot of strong parallels between designing technology and designing places, and that's the kind of thing that I'm really exploring in my research. And seeing whether designing technology can be a hook for encouraging young people to shape the world around them in different ways. So I'm very motivated by social justice and young people's rights to shape the city. That's already been said by other people. So obviously we can all see by now the value and the need for engaging young people in city making and making their city better. It's clear, I think. And digital technologies are offering a lot of promise for public participation, not just with young people, but with adults too. Obviously, it's helped us all stay connected through the pandemic. It's how we're able to hold such an event like this now and how we've got so many people here. But it's also providing young people in particular with new routes for getting involved in politics. As Karen was just talking about there, you can look at important movements like the climate strikes, like Black Lives Matter, and see the power of social media and other technologies. It helped young people organise, share resources, even through the pandemic. And I kind of went into my research then wondering, well, what can digital technology do for young people when it comes to shaping the city? And what can young people do with digital tech? So looking at both sides of the question, really, what can tech do for young people and what can young people do with tech? How can it support their involvement? Can it support their involvement in their cities? So that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years of my life, really, at Newcastle Uni, looking at 3 different projects within my PhD. So one of them was with primary school children, and I should say this is all based in the northeast of England around Newcastle. For Sense Explorers, I looked at how children might be able to gather data about their neighbourhood using different digital tools and use this to come up with ideas for making their city better. The second project that I looked at was in Sunderland with a group of young activists there. They're actually part of a youth council, which is a group set up by a local council, often a local council. And I know Nicola talked about the Mayfair Youth Forum, so there's probably some similarities there. And this essentially, this group of young people were looking at how they could address the state of the environment in their city and improve the environment. So I supported them in taking direct action, which is essentially cleaning up their city and looking at how tech can help. And then the third project, I've been very, very busy. The third project that I've looked at is working with a group of young activists who are very interested in public transport and improving public transport for young people like themselves. And what they actually did is they co-designed a website which would help give age-specific and age-appropriate transport information for young people in the North East. You know, recognising that actually a lot of young people are quite frightened to use public transport, especially younger young people. You know, there's a lot of preconceptions and fears perhaps when you first set out on a bus or a train, and it's really trying to help them with that. So digital technology came into all of that. The picture that you can see here, it's incredibly exciting. Essentially, we built some technology in our lab to allow young people in a couple of schools in Newcastle to actually detect and sense air pollution. I will admit now it was a very rough measure of what the air was like, but what we actually did is we used a little mini computer in a box that, you know, these were 8, 9, 10-year-old children who could go around and actually collect data about the air and about noise and about traffic and, you know, lots of different things to sense in their environment, and then use this as a resource for action. So that's the important thing. This wasn't an educational project. This was actually an activist project. This was encouraging children as young as 8-year-old to think, how can we make a change in our area? So that was incredibly exciting. And that engaged around 200 young people in schools across Newcastle. The resources that are developed for that are part of the toolkit. You can see that there, sense-explorers.uk, and anyone can use that. It's free and very easy to use. And then the other two projects I talked about, that involved a lot of collaboration with youth workers and with youth councils, and it was looking at how digital technologies can actually meet young people where they're at in the issues that they're already campaigning about. So the Sunderland group were looking at the environment, and the transport group were looking at public transport. And it was looking at essentially how how technology can actually help them in their endeavours. The transport group were designing technology, and the Sunderland group were essentially using different technologies and seeing what the value of those technologies was to their activism. A very important thing about being a researcher is ensuring that you don't just parachute in somewhere and then leave again and then never see you again. And I wanted to ensure a legacy from this research. So a couple of examples here. The top right is a toolbox, a physical toolbox. It is quite literally a toolbox. And that essentially was a collection of resources for the group in Sunderland to continue their work after I was gone, after I'd finished my research. This year they're looking at homelessness as an issue, and so they'll be applying some of the same methods to the idea of how can we tackle homelessness in Sunderland. And you can see a couple of other things there. Obviously, there's the group. They made a timeline to essentially map the progress that they've made through their activism. And the bottom right is the website, which is actually live and anyone can look at. I was, you know, when you get dead proud of them and saying, "Oh, isn't it amazing that they've actually made and designed this whole website? They wrote all the content themselves, found all the pictures." So this shows what's possible when you involve children and young people in the design of technology and in local issues at the same time. And while I'm still thinking about my findings, I think the emerging stuff that's coming through for me is actually seeing the value of using and designing technologies with young people for involving them in making their city better. So the work I did was very much early involvement. I worked with these groups for about 2 years in total, and in the PhD is 4 years. So think about, you know, that's half of the time I've done the research. So it's really important to kind of have that early and embedded involvement. Thinking about what their needs are and building on what they're already doing and what already works well. You know, one group, the Sunderland group, actually told me how they preferred pen and paper quite a lot, and they preferred doing these physical activities. That's what you can see with this map, you know, putting pins in the map physically rather than using, say, Google Maps. And really, it struck me that not all young people are the same. Their needs are very different depending on who they are, where they live, their background, and the socioeconomics. You know, we don't homogenise adults in the same way, saying that all young people do this or that. So we shouldn't be homogenising young people. And that's probably a way forward in answering the kind of the question of this whole session, really. And actually, it's really important to be thinking about designing appropriate methods too. As I said, meeting them where they're at in how they already use technologies. Just like you can't give young people a planning consultation survey and expect them to see any value in it. You know, why should they get involved in the first place? You can't just give them a random technology and expect them to relate to it. You know, ask them what technologies are they using already and how can we adapt those technologies for their participation in things that are important to them. We have an opportunity, I think someone noted in the questions, to look at the proposed reforms for planning with the government in the UK and the renewed focus on digital technologies to see how this might be able to be achieved. But we have got a long way to go before young people are actually mainstream participants, I think, in city making. But I think the main takeaway message I'd love to share with you really is that, you know, doing this work is very important. Understanding and learning and listening is very important. But it's very important to not just give them any sort of technology and expect them to be able to use it. A lot of young people don't have access to technology. We've already talked about that. Not a lot of young people maybe don't like technology. You know, we can't assume that every young person loves technology. A lot of the young people I work with for their activism preferred pen and paper. So it's important to not assume anything. Like we wouldn't assume with adults, we shouldn't really be assuming with young people. That's kind of one of the main takeaways from my research, really. And I'll just leave you with this as well. So with all the free time that I've got doing all these research projects, I'm involved in a wonderful charity called A Place in Childhood. They support young people to change our world, a nice snappy slogan there. But we essentially encourage young people to lead from the front in our projects. You know, we involve them as co-researchers, as young consultants. And the flavour of our different projects really, we've been tracking the experiences and perceptions of Scottish young people during the COVID-19 lockdown. We've got a report on that you can look at on our website. We've also worked with ZCD Architects, who got another mention earlier, on a report commissioned by the RTPI to look at planning policies and the child friendliness of planning policies in the UK. And we've also worked on other planning projects as well. So wonderful to be involved in actually in securing some of the impact of some of the things that I've been doing too. So I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully we've got a bit of time for questions, Simeon, but fingers crossed you all enjoyed that, and thank you very much for listening.
This was amazing. I mean, yeah, I think the point of not homogenizing young people just comes in my research all the time, especially when I talk to teens. It's just so many different personalities, and also, you know, it's just a reflection of society. So yeah, just that homogeneous young people term is really, I find it really problematic. Anyway, thank you, everyone. 80 people are still sticking up with us, even though we've completely trampled over any sort of time management. So I am going to shut up, and I'm going to give Tabitha the floor. If you're happy to stay for another 10 minutes or so, please hang around, and off to you, Tabitha. Whatever question you have for the panel.
Well, I'd like to start with Sean, as your presentation just came. I wanted to ask about the homelessness research that you did, as you mentioned. How do you feel about anti-homelessness architecture, and how do you think young people can help design architecture that will care for the homeless?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I will just preface that now and say that actually the work that I did with them wasn't around homelessness, it was around the environment. But what they're actually doing now is the group, I'm not working with the group anymore, unfortunately, but what they're looking at this year is homelessness. And it's really up to them to think about how they would kind of tackle it. But maybe a few ideas I can offer, Tabitha, potentially. I think, you know, maybe drawing on some of the methods that they've used in terms of, you know, engaging directly with groups. So I didn't have time to mention that the young people themselves actually leveraged a lot of connections that they had with the community. They worked with a group of older adults called the Seroptimists. They worked with local businesses and other local charities, one called Groundwork, for example. And actually they tried to coordinate all of these different voices and interests in the city. So I wonder whether this year they might actually be able to, you know, leverage some connections there and maybe work with homelessness charities, for example, Shelter, you know, working with local charities to try and address this issue in Sunderland. But I should say that the issue that they've chosen, they don't actually choose the issue as well. They there's a thing called Make Your Mark, which some people might have heard of, which is a massive youth ballot of young people across the country, actually. And Sunderland young people, there's usually tens of thousands of young people that vote, voted that homelessness was the biggest issue. So clearly not just the group that I work with, but young people across Sunderland think that's an issue. So I really do hope that they can kind of tackle it. And it's a pity I can't work with them, you know, but owing to my kind of capacity at the minute, but I'm really looking out for them and hope that they get to tackle that issue.
Thank you. I'd like to move to Tamara. I have a question that was originally from the chat that I really thought was good to ask. How do you feel about the plans to demolish the Brick Lane Council estate, and how do you think that will affect the youth of Brick Lane and Tower Hamlets' experience in their borough?
That falls out of the central area, unfortunately, so I don't actually know about that specific project. But obviously demolishing any kind of housing is incredibly difficult for anyone living in it. I mean, it destroys social infrastructure that exists and the community that exists. So I mean, I would always advocate for trying to keep buildings there unless there's no other way around it. But yeah, sorry, I can't actually bring any more clarifications on that one.
My second question, my personal question was, you mentioned that you had many opposing opinions from young people about the current housing. So have you been able to use those opinions or implement it into any recent housing plans? And if not, how will you consider this in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so the document itself doesn't actually include any specific plans. So it's not, we're not saying where buildings are or exactly how buildings are designed on specific plots. It's more guidance for anyone putting the proposals forward to tell them what it is that as a council is expected of them. And that also includes responding to existing character. So that's a policy that's written, but what that document does is explain what is the character that's there. So the feedback that we got helps us, so we're going to include that in the analysis of the existing buildings. So for example, at the moment, the draft document is kind of analysing the buildings from a much more kind of architectural value. So how they fit into the landscape, how they relate to the street. But from the feedback that we've got in the workshop, we could include that as kind of the analysis of the buildings. So we've got analysis of terrace houses, and then we can include, some people feel that they add to the character, but others might feel that it's preserving a kind of historic surrounding without necessarily allowing for improvements. So the issue that we're not allowing for change at all. Another comment that we got, for example, around the high-rise towers, you'd get opposing opinions on whether they look good or not, but then for some it's still a mark of kind of a link to history, something that hasn't changed, and the social value behind them. So it's kind of including that in the analysis that we'd ask anyone putting proposals forward to respond to.
Thank you very much. My last question goes to Nicola. In your key tips for involving young people in your designing, you mentioned that you have a couple of incentives for your for organizations that they may want to consider. Do you have an example of incentive that has worked personally for you, and just so others can have a vague idea of how to incorporate it in their practice?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of incentives that we're using in the Mayfair Youth Forum, I think the key one has been a professional skills training that we're delivering alongside the toolkit sessions, and that's delivered by an organisation called 2 to 3 Degrees, and it means that young people, on the weeks that we're not doing the toolkit sessions, when the design team are kind of considering what we discussed at them, they're being taught skills like CV writing, public speaking, teamwork, leadership, and they're getting something that's super valuable out of that. Alongside it, we're also offering work experience and work placements to the students that are taking part. And I think that the the young people are so excited by that, because otherwise they might not see a way in to work for an organisation like Grosvenor, which is something that we're really trying to change. And then as well as that, also making sure that each of them have a personal reference letter or some kind of something they can report back to and include in future uni applications or job applications to show they've done this amazing thing, but they can kind of prove that point from somebody that's involved in the business. And all of that, I'd just say, is around the kind of process, but there's also the point that we want to be able to do and deliver something tangible and meaningful in their neighbourhood. So that Meanwhile project that I talked about, making sure there's something that's a built form that they've been part of the design, the development, and perhaps the building of, that they can then see, walk past and have ownership of in their neighbourhoods.
Thank you. I think
This,
yeah.
this was brilliant. I think, Jonathan, this you are like my research participants, where I'm going, how do you feel about being a young person? And they're like, what about affordable housing? I don't care about being a young person. You know, what about the actual social problems? I think this is one really good wrap up about this event. You know, young people are not different to anybody else. They all care about the same issues. Is the only difference is that they probably have less power to do anything about it. So we should actually really, you know, support them to do that. And honestly, all of them come with really good ideas. Whenever we do anything with young people in any context, just the results are amazing. So definitely go and find people online. I'm just gonna put that in the chat. We will send you the questions and any slides available. Also the Jamboard, which has been really, really active. So this is partly probably my ambition to fit everybody in, and there was like 3 or 4 people that didn't make the cut. So we might follow up with something, but please go follow everybody from the speakers on social media, follow the BA on social media, and just engage with us. We really want to hear what you think. Yeah, people putting things in the chat. Thanks everybody. I mean, how many people have stuck? 65 people have stuck 15 minutes later. So this is amazing. And thanks to all the speakers. They'll have a Simeon favor voucher now, so they can all cash in at any point. And next time I will be much meaner. And 10 minutes is 10 minutes. I'm just saying that. Everyone, have a nice evening. I already am like 2 glasses down because this slight changing was really stressful. And anything you want to put in the chat, we'll put it in, we'll save it and we'll go through it, and I'll send some comments and some relevant information out there. But I hope everybody had a good time. I'm sorry if it was so rushed.
Thanks for organising, Simeon. It's been great.
Yay!
Thank you.
I mean, all of you are doing such a cool work, and you're also passionate. I mean, it just shows. It's really, it's just really nice to see that twinkle in people's eyes, you know, when they actually care about what they do.
Yeah, thanks for organising. It's really nice to hear from the other speakers as well and what they're doing. I'm sure we'll definitely like all somehow chat again.
Yeah.
Stuff happening.
Right, well, you're free to go. I have another meeting with, it's at 7:30, so, you know, Zooming life doesn't end.
It's going to be half a bottle of wine by then.
Oh my God, it will be such an, there is a mirror board as well on that meeting. Imagine, I will be, you know, all over. I hope they lock things. Anyway, one thing, Karen, make sure you send us the Jamboard afterwards. I would love to actually put that on social media as well.
It's going to get shared with everybody if people are still about, but thank you so much everyone who's contributed to the Jamboard. We're going to share it as a resource and hopefully continue to kind of add kind of suggestions to it. Definitely want it to be collaborative and just sharing kind of tips and tools so that people can make life better for young people. So yeah, thank you.
Really good.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the questions as well.